Hey guys, Brian from Boas here. Recently I acquired a pair of snakes which has been one of my dream snakes for quite a few decades actually, and I never thought I would have the opportunity to keep these beauties, and the opportunity arose, and I'm really happy to have this new pair of Sri Lankan pythons in my collection. Today I want to share them with you and say a little bit about them. I got these animals a few months ago. My friend Joe had a clutch of them and luckily made them available for me, and I was thrilled to add them to my collection. So these are Sri Lankan pythons, Python malaris pimbura, and they're actually, pimbura is a subspecies which is kind of not completely accepted. Most scientists actually classify them just as Python malaris, the Indian python, but the form from Sri Lanka, formerly known as Ceylon, is quite a bit different. It's got kind of this irregular, jagged looking saddle pattern. It's got kind of the head is a little bit shorter, and it's kind of got more of a orangey, pinkish color. They're also known as pink-headed pythons. And just in general, the coloration is a little bit different. To me anyway, they're a little bit more contrasty between, they have these kind of chocolatey brown saddles and this beautiful gray tan side markings. And if you look at a Burmese of Sri Lankan and an Indian python side by side, you can see the differences. There's also a small difference in the head scalation between the Indian and Sri Lankan pythons and the Burmese python. The Indian, the Sri Lankan, and the Burmese python were all once classified as different subspecies of Python malaris, but a few years ago the Burmese python was reclassified as a full species Python vivittatus, and the Sri Lankan and Indian python were grouped together as simply Python malaris. And so this guy is now going on 5 months old. He's about 4.5 months, doing really well. And he's actually put on, I haven't been keeping detailed measurements, but I'd say he's put on probably 6-7 inches at least. He definitely looks thicker than when I got him. And these animals, they can just grow quite a bit faster than the Boas. I've always liked Burmese and Indian pythons. My first really big snake was a Burmese python. This is back in the 90s. At the time, the animal, he grew up to, or she actually grew to about 9 feet in a year. I was feeding her quite a bit, probably more than I should have, but I was just a kid with a big snake, so I didn't really have the experience. But these guys I'm feeding about once a week. Right now they're eating small to medium-sized rats, kind of alternating also some jumbo mice just to give them some variety. And my friend tells me they love to eat quails and birds and chicks as well, so I'm going to try some of those. But he said they can also get a little picky if they get nothing but birds. But I really am enjoying these guys. There's definitely a difference between the Boas and the pythons. These guys are just super smart. It's like I look inside of their enclosure and they're like looking at me and like interacting with me through the enclosure. I've heard that a lot of people say reticulated pythons are super smart. I've never kept a retic, but these Sri Lankan pythons are definitely have quite a bit going on in their head. Not to say Boas aren't smart, but there's just something different about holding these guys. They're just more aware of their surroundings, and it's just almost more like a dog in a way. But this guy, this is my male. You can see he's got these really jagged looking markings, which are found on the Sri Lankan pythons. Indians and Burmese, the saddles and the markings in general are kind of more rounded. I also noticed these Sri Lankans, you can see they've got these really jagged markings. They've got some individual dots of pattern as well. It's a really interesting looking pattern. It's kind of like when you look at different types of giraffes. They all have kind of a different pattern, and the shape of the blotches on the giraffe's neck are different depending upon the subspecies of giraffe. So it's the same way with these pythons. As I mentioned, the Sri Lankan python has been kind of a bucket list species for me. One of my dream species of snakes. I believe there's only like maybe 4 or 5 others on this list, which I'm not going to share with you today. But on this bucket list, I've been looking or really interested in Sri Lankan pythons and Indian pythons in general since I was 12 or 13. And at the time, my mother was working at this library and they had books, and she would bring me home books about reptiles and I would read them. And one of the books was called Living Reptiles of the World by the famous herpetologist Carl P. Schmidt. And incidentally, he ended up dying from a boomslang bite the same year that this was published, 1957. And what's famous about it is, at the time, people didn't think the boomslang was all that dangerous or deadly. It was just a rear fang snake. And he gets bitten by it, doesn't think it's that big of a deal, doesn't seek medical intervention, but decides to record his symptoms. And over the 24 hours or so that followed, he wrote down all of his symptoms of everything he was experiencing. And he couldn't record his death, of course, but unfortunately he died, not that long after being bitten. But anyway, I digress. This book has lots of pictures of snakes, and I would look at the pictures and have my favorites, of course. And one of my all-time favorite pictures to look at was this one. Okay, and it's just you can see it says Indian python, Python malaris. And incidentally, this book does not differentiate between the Indian and the Sri Lankan python. But I always saw this snake, and this one just always was stuck in my mind. And I ended up actually getting an Indian python about 20 years ago, which I still have. He's my big boy. He's about probably about 12 or 13 feet. But he looks considerably different than this one. He's not as lightly colored, and the shape of his markings is a little bit different. But I'm not sure if this is a Sri Lankan python, but it's kind of noteworthy that the head of this animal is kind of this lighter orangey color, and it's kind of got the jagged looking markings, and the side pattern and coloration is more reminiscent of a Sri Lankan python. So this may well be a Sri Lankan python. But this is a snake that I always held up there as, wow, that's just an amazing looking animal, and I really hope I can ever see an animal like this, or better yet, have it in my collection. So that's kind of how I got interested in the pythons, or the Burmese pythons in general, and Sri Lankan and Indian pythons. And then, of course, not that long later, maybe 5-6 years later, in my late teens, I got my Burm. It was a great snake and got really big. And then I got my Indian python about 20 years ago, and now I have the Sri Lankan python. So it's great to have kept all three species, and really looking forward to watching these beautiful babies grow up in the next few years. And this is my female Sri Lankan python. So she's pretty similar looking to the male. Her markings are a little bit different. To me, her head looks a little bit more orangey pink in color. And I think that as she grows older, maybe that the coloration will develop some more based on, pictures of these animals that I've seen. But they're just so beautiful to look at. I mean, I'm just, when I got these animals, I unpacked them and I looked at them and I was just, breathless, or speechless, I should say, because they were just so beautiful. And I love my Boas, but there's just something about the patterns of these animals. It's almost hypnotic. It's like just so amazing to look at, and the way that they interact with the handler is just a little bit different from Boas, and definitely enjoying having these animals. And so I feeding them about once a week. I imagine that they'll probably put on a few feet a year. The top size of these animals, depending where you read, is anywhere from about 9 to about 12 feet. Well, I'll just have to see. My Indian python that's now about 12 or 13 feet, I didn't think he was going to get bigger than that, but he ended up getting bigger. So it may be that, these animals, they just get a little bit bigger than people think. They don't quite get as big as the Burmese, of course, but definitely bigger than Boas. And it's definitely a different type of snake to keep than a boa. But I'm just, enjoying these animals. I don't know if I'm going to breed them, to be honest, because they lay eggs, and being a boa breeder, I'm used to having the live birth. But these animals, they won't be ready to breed anyway for at least 3 or 4 years, so I'm not really thinking about that at this point. Yeah, just look at her. Look at the head of this one. It's just really beautiful looking. So those are my Sri Lankan pythons. Again, one of my dream snakes that I can add to the collection, and one of my few non-boa snakes that I have. I just have the 3 pythons now in addition to all my boas. So I'd like to hear what you think of them. You know, if you have a dream snake that you think you might never get, but you're just, you know, keeping all hope that you might get it someday, you know, please add it to the comments for the discussion. And, you know, I'll probably make videos on these guys pretty regularly just so I can document their growth, because these guys are going to grow quite a bit faster than the boas. So, you know, hopefully in another few months we'll take them out again and see how they're doing. Hope you enjoyed the video. Shoot me any questions you may have. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your boas and pythons.